You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
I think of him sometimes in terms of the TV character Columbo, who seemed bumbling at first, and until he'd figured out what it was that he wanted to ask, and then he pinned it down. And Henry had this started slow until he got a sense of the audience and the listeners, and then there was a point where he would prop his glasses up on his forehead, and his friends referred to this as the war cant. And all of a sudden, he would go from just ordinary discourse to transcendent oratory, and it was apparently really something amazing to experience.
When you need to build up your team to handle the growing chaos at work, use Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It gives your job post the boost it needs to be seen and helps reach people with the right skills, certifications, and more. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. That's Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need a hiring hero? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs.
John Kukla has directed research and publishing at the Library of Virginia and directed the historic New Orleans collection and the Red Hill, the Patrick Henry National Memorial in Charlotte County, Virginia. He is the author of Mr. Jefferson's Women and A Wilderness So Immense, The Louisiana Purchase, and the Destiny of America, as well as many scholarly articles and reviews. He has held research fellowships in the British Museum, the Virginia Historical Society, and the International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello, and has been a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians. He is here to discuss his book, Patrick Henry, Champion of Liberty. John, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Delighted to be here.
We hear about Patrick Henry in learning about history, but so often it's about the one speech, give me liberty or give me death. But your book reveals how he was as much a revolutionary as anybody in Massachusetts, and he was kind of the Sam Adams of Virginia. Talk a bit about his other contributions.
Sure. Well, one of the things that makes Henry unusual, I suppose, even for his generation, is the fact that he was involved in so much of the era of the Revolution. You know, he first came on the scene in the Parsons Cause in 1763. That particular legal thing dealt with some of the same constitutional issues of the relationship between the colonies and the authority of Parliament and the King that then arose in the Stamp Act. In 1765 with the Stamp Act crisis, and then arguably the constitutional issues defining the Stamp Act crisis were pretty much the same ones that were fought over in the War for Independence starting in 76. And then Henry continued to be involved in politics through the 1790s. So he was very much involved in the early years of the movement toward a strengthened Continental Congress that then ultimately becomes the movement toward writing and ratifying a new constitution. He was opposed to the ratification of the Constitution, he was a little bit fearful about the transfer of what he thought was too much power to the federal government, and also the need for a better definition of American liberties, which ultimately leads to the Bill of Rights. He retires from active politics in Virginia in the very early 1790s, but is even spoken about as a presidential candidate. And then finally, he departs the scene at the age of 63 when he dies in June of 1799. So for 30-some years, he's active in political life during that entire era of the American Revolution.
Let's talk a bit about that at the beginning, because that Parsons Cause is interesting. If I have it right, I could have it wrong, the Parsons actually went to Britain to get their justice over what they didn't like, a decision that was made by the Virginia government.
Yes.
And in doing so, set up an early battle in the 1760s, British versus Virginia power and authority.
That's exactly right. They took exception to a temporary law that had been passed by the Virginia legislature, a fairly complex legal and economic situation, but basically it was a temporary law designed to ease the effects of bad crops on the taxpayers, and with an eye towards fairness, as the legislature saw it. The Parsons saw themselves as losing out on what should have been a windfall in the payment of their salaries, and rather than protesting it in the legislature in Virginia when the law was being enacted, there were a couple of these guys who basically wanted to assert greater church authority, bishop's authority, and ultimately royal authority in the life of the church in Virginia. And so they took it to the Bishop of London, who had responsibility for the colonies, and he in turn was able to get the authorities in England to overrule the law. So what happens in the Parsons cause, a series of legal cases in which the Parsons are suing their vestries or church councils for back pay, is that Henry makes the arguments that a number of the legislators in Virginia did, that basically this was an area in which the Virginia legislature was predominant, and that it shouldn't be subject to being overruled or modified by Parliament and the Crown. The timing is such that these arguments over the governance of the church in Virginia play immediately into the announcement by the Grenville administration that they're going to impose a stamp tax on the colonies. The issues have been, in a sense, well rehearsed in the Virginia political system, and it's part of the reason that that these wealthy slaveholding planters suddenly sound like a bunch of boss radicals.
Talk about how persuasive Patrick Henry was.
One of the impediments to writing about Henry, of course, is that his oratory was a big part of his political career, obviously. And there's no tape recordings, there's no video. There's oftentimes there's that to the extent that we have a transcript of what was said, it's one that was reconstructed by people who heard him and tried to put down on paper what he had said. But what we do have is the reactions of listeners. Henry had been influenced early in his life by one of the evangelical preachers of the Great Awakening, a man named Samuel Davies, who later he was a Hanover evangelical, and then later ends his career as president of what's now Princeton University. So Henry learned from Davies, who was just a generation later than Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, learned the sort of rhetorical style of the evangelical preachers, and then brought to it the political outlook of the basically of the Virginia and the colonial leaders, and it made for a very, very powerful thing. One of the ironies, I think, that I discovered in writing about Henry and his oratory is that it's perhaps not his speaking ability that made him so effective. It's rather his apparently very, very unusual ability to read an audience, to engage in conversation, in short, to listen and to figure out what his hearer, his listener, whether it's in a conversation or whether it's in a courtroom or in a jury or a legislature, to kind of figure out where they are and how he can connect to them in a persuasive way. And I think of him sometimes in terms of the TV character Columbo, who seemed bumbling at first, and until he'd figured out what it was that he wanted to ask, and then he pinned it down. And Henry had this started slow until he got a sense of the audience and the listeners, and then there was a point, as his followers or his people who wrote about this say, there was a point where he would prop his glasses up on his forehead, and his friends referred to this as the war cant. And all of a sudden, he would go from just ordinary discourse to transcendent oratory, and it was apparently really something amazing to experience.
And as a result of this, we see Patrick Henry as a significant leader, he's really commanding the militant forces of the Patriots in the Virginia area against the then governor,
right,
and also becomes a state governor several times.
Yeah, he serves the first 3 years as the first elected governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia from 76 to 79, and they had 1-year terms and a 3-year term limit in the Constitution. So he comes back after the wars ended. He comes back for 2 more years in the 1785 and 6 and 7 as governor. So he serves a total of 5 terms as governor, and then almost 30 years in the legislature, all told, between the colonial and the independent legislature of the state.
Some people remember him, or in some accounts, they say he was a tavern keep. But is that really true?
First of all, we should define tavern in terms of 18th century Virginia and also English practice. Basically, what they were hotels. They were the ordinaries. They were the place that if you were traveling, you could get a room, you could get a meal, you could have your horse, bedded and fed, and you could also get a drink. Henry's father-in-law ran what's now known as Hanover Tavern, which is then 100 yards of Hanover Courthouse at the courthouse of Hanover County, and it was there that he was living at the time that he read law and ultimately passed the bar. And there are arguments that go on among his dissenters and his detractors as to whether or not he was just a common bartender, as some of them would have it, or whether he helped his father run the place, or father-in-law rather, which is probably closer to the truth. But to say that he was a tavern keeper in the sense of just slinging drinks would be to misunderstand the nature of an 18th century tavern, which was a little bit more like a hotel or a bed and breakfast.
And there are some accounts that he was backwoods, but Hanover County really not backwoods per se at this time.
That's right. It was definitely it was a very prosperous place. Hanover is one of those counties in Virginia that unwisely sent its records to Richmond for safekeeping during the Civil War, and the building in which they were kept went up in flames at the fall of Richmond at the end of the war. So we don't have quite the documentation we'd like to, but essentially Hanover is on the western tributaries of the York River, and essentially there was a lot of movement of really wealthy families and their descendants who went west along the line of those rivers, which parallel to the south. You've got the James River Valley inviting a similar kind of western movement. And Hanover was a bustling place in the 18th century, and in fact, at one point there was talk in the legislature of moving the capital from Williamsburg, which is on the peninsula between the York and the James, of moving it actually to Hanover, some 60 miles north and west.
And he's very involved, a significant figure. And the fact that he's been somewhat lost to history, again, everyone knows the name Patrick Henry because of the famous speech, but you would almost think for many that he was just a person that gave one speech and then Jefferson and Washington took over from there, but really not so. He was a governor. He, if I'm correct, some of the issues that he would advocate, and he's a very strong supporter of education, freedom of religion.
Very much so.
Obviously, the Patriot cause. He seemed to also have a bit more of a belief in the strength of executive power, even within a Republican government, as strong as a Republican he was.
Yes.
He wanted the state of Virginia, which he had a role in crafting. He wanted that state to have a stronger governor than what it got.
That's true, and in some ways his concern, which he expressed in the writing of the Constitution, the first Constitution of Virginia in 1776, his concern to have a strong governorship was in part, the wisdom of that was proven when the British invaded Virginia in 1780 and 81 at the end of the war, and it was difficult for the executive branch to respond to those measures given the limits that had been placed on its power. Henry was really prepared to, when he was in office, he was prepared to exert the powers of his office for what he thought was the good of the population and the Commonwealth. And I think it's kind of interesting, for example, he often gets dragged into debates on the relative strengths of state versus federal authority. And I think it's really quite clear that although Henry was jealous of letting authority be transferred from the state to Congress, just as he had been jealous of and suspicious of Parliament and the King. This is not there's no animus toward government itself. And I think he recognized that one of the ways to have effective government and to defend one's liberties and stuff was to have a government that was close and honest and well run, and try to do things he saw it as at the state level to the extent that one can. And in some ways, in the 18th century, the state government protected the counties.
I mean, Virginia was an enormous state at that time.
It was. It was a huge state up until the point where it ceded its. Essentially, it laid claim to the Ohio Valley, and toward the end of the Revolution, it offered to give up its claim to the 7 states that comprised what was then called the Old Northwest, reaching all the way up to Wisconsin and Minnesota. It ceded those land claims to Congress in exchange for the other states giving up all of their claims as well.
He was a good friend and supporter of George Washington, also of Virginia, and he had a role much uncelebrated, but you reveal it in your book, of protecting Washington's place as general of the Continental Armies during what's known as the Conway Cabal.
Yeah.
Could you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, it's a little known story. Frankly, Henry's and Washington's relationship is something that people don't comprehend or appreciate, because one of the things that Henry did, although most of the first 3 years of the war was being fought in the North, Virginia sent food and recruits and ammunition and all kinds of materiel to support Washington and his army. And with Henry in the governor's chair, Henry did a lot of that work with Washington, and so they really forged a working relationship during the early years of the war. And then, as it happens, Henry was governor when a letter came to him from somewhere in North. It was an unsigned letter. This was a practice that some of the patriots had undertaken because they didn't want to risk their correspondence being captured by the British and published in embarrassing ways in the newspapers and stuff. So they would leave a letter unsigned with the expectation that the recipient would recognize the handwriting. In this case, Benjamin Rush wrote from the Philadelphia Revolutionary, wrote from the North to Henry, basically advocating Washington's retirement as the commander-in-chief of the American armies, and his replacement by Horatio Gates. At this particular moment, Washington's forces were kind of bogged down in protecting in Pennsylvania and New York, and the contrast with Gates, who had just accepted Burgoyne's surrender at Saratoga, in 1778, and thereby brought the French in as an formal ally and so on. The contrast between Washington's seeming failures and Gates' lustrous success had led a group of people around Washington, and notably General Conway, to start agitating for Washington's replacement. To make a complex story very, 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 very brief, what happens is that Henry gets this letter, sees it. Rush thought that Henry would join in, to overthrow Washington. Instead, Henry writes to Washington and says, somebody sent me this letter. I don't know who it came from, but you should know about it. Washington did recognize who it was and essentially scotched the whole thing. But what perhaps is of lasting importance is that Washington, into the last year of their respective lives, Henry died in June and Washington in December of 1799, into the last year of their lives, Washington was still referring to this act of support and friendship on behalf of Henry, and never ever lost his faith in Henry's inherent commitment to the good of America, even though the two of them could not have been further apart on the question of whether or not to ratify the new Constitution.
Now, Washington certainly didn't hold a grudge in that way. Someone didn't attack him personally. Differences on the Constitution were something he was well aware of, and in fact probably sought out to persuade those people more than the ones that agreed with them, and he wanted to get closer with them, the Richard Henry Lee or the Patrick Henry. But indeed, Patrick Henry. Well, let's start with that. I think I want to hammer down on that point a bit because I think it's so significant that his role in the Conway cabal might have saved Washington's tenure as general, and it would be somewhat speculation to consider what that might have done to the war. It's hard to tell. The generalship was, such a large war and such many moving pieces. But it's possible that would have had an impact in the war. Certainly in the American Civil War, the changing of generals all the time was, for politics, was something that might have certainly hurt the Union effort. But it certainly would have deprived us, if he were not general throughout the tenure, he probably wouldn't have been president, and certainly would have deprived us of a first president, maybe a president of the Constitutional Convention, and everything else goes from there. So what a role Henry played in that.
Here's a situation, have you ever been in it? I have, working at home, is that all of a sudden somebody put a meeting on the calendar. What? There's a meeting in 3 minutes? No problem. I grab my navy blue linen suit jacket and put it on. It doesn't matter if I have a black t-shirt on, a polo shirt, a little more casual that I might wear working at home. I bought my navy blue linen suit jacket at Quince. And I highly recommend Quince. As you know, good materials, well-made clothes, not too expensive. Upgrade your everyday. Download the Quince app for app-exclusive offers or go to quince.com/myhist. Get free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada and the UK too. That's QUINCE.com/MYHIST.
When you need to build up your team to handle the growing chaos at work, use Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It gives your job post the boost it needs to be seen and helps reach people with the right skills, certifications, and more. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. That's Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need a hiring hero? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs.
Yeah, and I think, military historians recognize that Washington was playing a long game, and basically recognized that he had to keep his army in the field without losing, until such time as the British finally had enough, and of course that's what he did over a sustained period of time. And there are always, I suppose, the people who who are impatient and want something ended with one decisive swoop. Yeah, Washington was playing the longer game, and then as many people have pointed out, what made Washington extraordinary in world history is that after successfully leading the army to victory in the American Revolution, he stepped down and went home as a private citizen rather than seizing power as had been the history of so many other places in other times, going back to the Greeks and the Romans. That's not to say he didn't involve himself in continuing to want to make sure that the revolution was successful, but he was prepared to step down from military and to decline political office until such time as he was basically called back to, as you said, to preside over the writing of the new Constitution, and then it was pretty well agreed upon by everyone that he was the only figure who could possibly serve as the first president.
And perhaps Patrick Henry could have been the second one, as you referenced earlier.
Yes, yeah, that's an interesting wrinkle that was is skipped over, I guess. Henry basically by 1796, which is when Washington announces that 2 terms is enough, and so the election of 1796 ends up with John Adams as president and Thomas Jefferson as vice president. Henry was much talked about as a regional candidate, and for that matter, one of the names that people did recognize in all of the states, rather than just knowing their local dignitaries and eminencies. But Henry was talked about as a possible candidate for president. At that time, the Electoral College rules were different than they are today, in that whoever got the highest number of votes would become president, and the second highest number of votes became vice president, which is what happened with Adams and Jefferson. Although by the 1790s, of course, America was going toward a system of political parties that the founders in Philadelphia did not foresee and probably were disdainful toward. But and Henry certainly did. Basically, when he got word that people were thinking about him as a presidential candidate, by this time he's not in good health, and has already declined all kinds of offers of federal appointment, the Supreme Court and ambassadorships and this and that and the other that Washington offered to him. But he's not in good health, and he basically publishes a letter that gets reprinted throughout the up and down the East Coast, basically saying, I don't want to be a candidate for president, because he did not want to play the role of, a spoiler, a Ross Perot, if you will.
A reminder that I'm talking to John Kukla. His book is Patrick Henry, Champion of Liberty. Patrick Henry comes off as a very empathetic, very nuanced person, a person that was a good executive, could read situations well and make a good decision. He knew how people would think. He knew when he had the people behind him. I wish you would talk a bit about how that comes into play with the issue of slavery. He wasn't totally opposed to some kind of solution in terms of slavery, or ideas that might even be advanced or liberal for his time and his place in Virginia, but he certainly wasn't an abolitionist.
Correct. One of the things that I'm proud about having accomplished in this book is fleshing out a clearer picture of Henry's attitudes towards slavery over the course of his life, and I had the good fortune to find some documentation of his interaction with a number of Quakers who were seeking to fight against slavery over the course of 30 years. Many of them are in the Quaker archives at Haverford College outside Philadelphia. But Henry began. We don't have any written commentary on slavery from Henry until the late 1760s, by which time he's already in his 30s and active in politics. So we don't have boyhood musings, and partially that's because the family records, the family papers, probably burned in a mansion fire in early in the 20th century. But Henry, what we do know is what Samuel Davies, that influential evangelical, and Henry's uncle, who was an Anglican minister, we do know very clearly what they were saying about slavery at the time of Henry's youth, and it would have been typical for most Virginians, which is basically that slavery was nothing wrong with it. Gosh, it's in the Bible. But it was the responsibility of slaveholders, by this view, basically to treat their slaves well, teach them to read, and bring them to Christianity. So if that's the perspective that is prevailing in Virginia in the 1730s and 40s when Henry's a young man, what becomes interesting by the 1770s is the fact that by that time Henry has decided that slavery is a bad thing in general for the state, and more particularly in 1773 in an exchange of correspondence that was well known and has been well known for years. Henry declares that slavery is evil, that it is a sin, that there's no legal or moral or even religious justification for slavery, that it is wrong. And yet, in a letter that I regard as admirable, not necessarily for all of its sentiments, but certainly for its candor, Henry refers to the fact that he not only owns slaves, but they are slaves of my own purchase. In other words, unlike some of the Tidewater aristocrats who could say, gosh, our families had slaves for 4 generations, Henry's saying, I am complicit in slavery. I have purchased slaves, and yet it is wrong. It can't be defended on any moral or legal grounds. It's just the way things work here in this fallen world. He continues to hold that perspective up until the last sentiments that we know as in the 1790s, when he's basically retiring from politics. By this time, his position is slavery is wrong. It is repugnant. It's something that the North, as we enter into a stronger government and start arguing over how to pass taxes and stuff, it's something that the North will naturally come to oppose and to attack because it's so repugnant, it's evil, it's nasty, it's awful, and therefore it's going to become under attack. And yet, what can we do about it? He did not participate in the belief that colonization, that the establishment of what becomes the establishment of Liberia and transporting African Americans back to the African continent, that he didn't see that as something that was at all workable. And so ultimately he comes to the position that so many Southerners did in the 18th century, which is basically it's wrong. I don't know how to get rid of it, so what we can do is treat them well, teach them to read, and bring them to Christianity.
One of the things that he seemed to be very much for is when Virginia attempted to put a ban on, say, an absolute ban on even freeing a slave. If a master wanted to free a slave at the end of their life, or when the state of Virginia interceded in some cases or attempted to ban that, it seemed like sometimes at the insistence of the Quakers that he met with, or just on his own, he would oppose those efforts. In other words, at least preserving the avenue that some slaves could be freed.
Absolutely, and he was in support of he gave some legal counsel to this Quaker Robert Pleasants, who made an early experiment at freeing the slaves that Pleasant owned. He wanted to free them and give them land and see if they could make it as small independent farmers. And Henry seems to have been involved in giving Pleasance legal advice on that sort of thing. I like to point out that for all the well, I don't know if I like to point out one must, I think, dealing with the horrors of slavery. I think one must recognize on the part of the revolutionary generation that although they did not deal with slavery as effectively as we might wish, nevertheless, we look to them for having basically declared that it is wrong. And there's a sense in which, unlike, for example, in the years leading up to the Civil War, when there was an argument put forward by a number of Southerners that slavery was somehow a positive good, the revolutionary generation had no illusions about that. Slavery is an evil, wrongful thing, and in that sense, they're setting the moral standard by which we judge their failure to do anything.
Hear that? That's now Crispy and McCrispy strips meeting Creamy Caesar sauce. Sounds extra crispy. Caesar sauce at McDonald's for a limited time. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
Every Wednesday, we talk AI, robotics, and all the smart doohickeys all around us on Intelligent Machines. Hi, this is Leo Laporte from the Twit Podcasting Network, inviting you to join me, Jeff Jarvis, and Paris Martineau. Our guest, Henry Blodgett. He was there at the dot-com crash in 2008. Now he's all in on AI. Is he here for the 2026 AI crash? Find out this week on Intelligent Machines. You'll find it at twit.tv/IM or wherever you get your podcasts.
I think that's an interesting point, an important one to make. It's so often brought up that there's this great contradiction between the statements made by the revolutionaries and liberty or death, or life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the practice of slavery. But they weren't unaware of that contradiction. In a lot of cases, they could have been braver. Certainly, they deserve criticism from moderns. But of course, we are moderns, and we're in our situation, so that criticism has to be limited by that fact. It's inescapable. While they certainly failed to exercise or even get something going where there might have been a pace out of or phase out of slavery.
Right. And I think what you were pointing out in terms of issues of manumission, the right of a slaveholder to free his own slaves, that's one of the accomplishments that Henry was certainly in agreement with, and in fairness to the 18th century Virginians, at least, they were adamant in closing off the slave trade, the importation of more enslaved persons into North America. Although there are some cynics who would say, well, there were already a sufficient labor force in Virginia and Maryland, as opposed to the Carolinas, for example, that were adamant in extending the slave trade for at least 20 years.
Yeah, it's certainly a tough issue. One tends to think that perhaps, or hopes that perhaps, ending the slave trade plus manumission plus some colonization, perhaps all of these, some compensation, all of these measures, if the revolutionary generation's mindset had continued, might have led to a better outcome. But later, with the new attitude and the new generations and the expansion of slavery, that unfortunately those ideals didn't persist. Yeah,
exactly. I think one of the things that this kind of discussion should inspire in a thoughtful, reader or citizen is a recognition that the revolutionary generations faced some intractable problems and didn't solve them and failed. But that's a fair judgment. But when we look at ourselves, there are plenty of things where we too fall short in doing what we may know is right or think is right.
I think it's an excellent observation. These were mortal people with political problems, very complex political problems. One of the big debates, of course, was the Constitution. Mm-hmm. Patrick Henry figures in to that. He was adamantly opposed to the Constitution. He opposes it at the Virginia ratifying convention, and I guess you could talk a bit about that, and then also, is that the reason, perhaps, that he's not well known in history? Do we kind of black out the people who oppose the Constitution?
I think there is a bit of a tendency to celebrate the advocates of the Constitution. In Henry's case, however, I think one of the things that separates him from the prominent Virginians that we do remember is the fact that aside from 2 years in the Continental Congress, in the First and Second Continental Congress in the years right before independence, Henry never held national office. He was always in state office. And as a result, I suppose, in the same way that, let's say that if John Hancock hadn't had a distinctive signature, we might not remember him as prominently because he didn't go on to become a president or a major senator or something like that under the government that the present Constitution. But yeah, he was absolutely adamant in wanting modifications, amendments made to alter what he found was the problems of the Constitution as it had been written in Philadelphia. And in the background of that, and I tell this story in the book, we don't have to go into it now, but in the background of that, there were events going on in the 1785 and 6 where Congress was contemplating in terms of in the context of negotiating a trade treaty with Spain. Congress was some congressmen were contemplating surrendering the use or the right to navigate the Mississippi River, and Henry saw that as being a kind of a sectional conflict and a betrayal that caused him to be a great deal more suspicious in 1780. Two years later, when the Constitution was written and ratified, he was a good deal more suspicious about the possible antipathy of northern interests as opposed to what he saw as Virginia's best interests.
And yet, later in his life, the kind of last chapter, we think, we've now set up Patrick Henry as opposed to the Constitution, and perhaps that means opposed to the Federalist Party and with kind of the Jeffersonian Republicans, but yet when Washington calls on him and asks him to run for Congress, I believe, he runs with a special message that perhaps could be a message for all of us.
Yes.
That this party system is wrong and you have to unite. And he actually comes out and runs as, if not a proclaimed Federalist, at least a supporter of the party that's in government, of the government, and against the kind of Jeffersonian Republicans and Madison and that lot.
Yeah, I mean, it's a terribly vituperative and divisive time, the 1780s in general, in American politics, and it's in that context. It's made worse by world events because, of course, England and France are and their allies are all engaged in the wars of the French Revolutionary era. So in terms of the kind of a climate of opinion, it's almost like what we experienced in the first half of the 20th century with the Cold War. That kind of just divisive world situation, and then some divisive politics at home. And Henry, like Washington, basically didn't ever warm to the idea of political parties, and so when the parties were hammering at one another, he saw that as being something that could be very damaging. And when Washington asked him to basically run for office as a moderate, that was something that was the only person in the world that could have called Henry back into politics, and basically that's what he spoke for at the last election, where he made a speech at Charlotte Courthouse calling for unity. warning that as somebody as he put it in the accounts that we have of that speech, if people want to overthrow the government, first they should try to change things by constitutional ways, play by the rules first, because as he saw it, the risk of overthrowing the government was that you would end up with either anarchy or tyranny. In many respects, of course, this is exactly what happens a few years later when Napoleon declares himself an emperor.
I think it's just if there was a movie to be made of Patrick Henry, a significant movie, it just makes that speech at the courthouse just makes for a good final scene, I think, because after his message, that's his last couple of months there.
Yeah, and that's characteristic of a good deal of his career. There's a moment at the end of the ratifying convention in Virginia in 1788 where Henry is lost by 10 votes and Virginia has ratified, and a bunch of disgruntled anti-federalists get together to basically protest, and Henry is called to meet with them, and he says, "Gentlemen, we have made our case in the constitutional way, in the forum in which we should. We have made our case. We have lost. It's time for us to go home."
And that's an important moment for the confidence that would be in the Constitution. Yeah, it really does seem like America has in a sense lost at least a full picture of a founder, and one that's probably closer to that word than many others. And by doing that, of course, this is My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. We're always looking at the impact of history of politics of today. It just seems like we've lost a potential model, maybe, for so many things. The proper role of government on one side of the debate, but maybe perhaps right in the middle, and also issues like education and voting rights and so many other issues. Perhaps we've lost a model, and perhaps this book, which is John Kukla's Patrick Henry, Champion of Liberty, will set the record straight.
Hope so.
John, thanks for coming on My History Can Beat Up Your Politics.
Absolutely. This was fun.
I want to thank John Kukla for coming on the program. And keep in mind that you can support the program by subscribing to the Premium Podcast at www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpoliticspremium.com. You'll get bonus episodes. In the last episode, we talked a lot about Andrew Johnson's impeachment and didn't get time to delve into some characters. D.R. Anthony, the firebrand, abolitionist and newspaper publisher. Samuel Pomeroy, the senator who chided Edmund Ross for being corrupt, but may have been just as corrupt as he. And going back in the time machine, Luther Martin, the lawyer for Samuel Chase, who also attended the Constitutional Convention and had some criticisms of the impeachment clause that are interesting to hear given the 2 centuries of history. So we look at all of that in leftovers from the impeachment podcast, available on the Premium Podcast at www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpoliticspremium.com, including more about the story of Andrew Johnson's impeachment. www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpoliticspremium.com. It's not too late to get $25 off with your first purchase with our sponsor, Bombfell, unique styling service for men. BOMBFELL.com/myhistory. Thanks for listening.